Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of At the Movies with William Fletcher. As per usual, I am your host, William Fletcher, and this week by a new guest, someone who's not done this show before, so it's going to be interesting to see how this goes. Zach Ruggiero.
Hello. Happy to be here.
For this week's episode, this is going to be part one of a two-part retrospective look at the directorial filmography of Alexander Payne. So, we're covering 4 films this week: Citizen Ruth, Election, About Schmidt, and Sideways. And then next week we'll be talking about The Descendants, Nebraska, Downsizing, and The Holdovers. So that'll be what we're covering next week. But this week we're covering the first 4 films. I was unable to find Citizen Ruth. It's surprisingly more difficult to find than I was expecting. But Zach has seen it as a film, so Zach can, because you're a big fan, started watching the films for the purposes of this, and I don't get it.
So this will be interesting because he's become one of my favorites over time. Definitely. I wouldn't say he's necessarily my number 1 favorite director or anything like that.
Is that Adam McKay?
No, it's not Adam McKay. It's probably Paul Thomas Anderson, if I'm being honest. But Payne, I just find his work to be. I'm just such a fan of the human. I'm such a fan of the way he does his characters. They all feel so human to me. I mean, we're going to get into this more in depth when we actually touch on the films. But I think if I was picking one thing that's my favorite element about him as a director, it's how he crafts his characters and the performances he gets from his actors.
No, I think in terms of performances, I do agree that generally the performances are all good. I just do not get into the more emotional aspects of his films like that. I can tell what he's doing, what he's saying, what he's trying to achieve with his films, but they just do not connect with me. But yes, so to start off, Citizen Ruth, his sort of first real feature film. I don't know. I did a bit of reading on what this film was. It's from what I've gathered, it's a film about abortion or abortion rights or something to that effect. Am I incorrect?
Yeah, it's a bit messy. You can tell it's a first feature, but if you're summing it up into one brief synopsis, it's a satire about the abortion issue in America, basically. And he does do a good job of he's making fun of the pro-choice and the pro-life crowds. I'm sure it's very even with its satirization. You can tell he's more himself on the pro-choice side, but he doesn't really hold back on skewering either side, which I do appreciate. It doesn't feel preachy or anything. And it feels, this and Election, I think, do feel a little isolated from the rest of his filmography because they're pure comedies, while the rest of his films are more dramas with comedic elements. You've seen Election, right?
I've seen Election.
This is similar in tone to Election, of how it's a pure political satire. This is definitely a lot messier than Election, which is understandable, first feature and all that. It's not my favorite of his. It would rank, it's in the bottom 3. I do still like it. There's things I appreciate about it. It's pretty funny for the most, which is probably the most important thing for a satire. That's number one. Its number one goal is to make you laugh. I did laugh at the film. I do just think it's, compared to a director you brought up earlier, who I appreciate a lot, Adam McKay, I always feel like his stuff is a little more pointed. You can really tell what he's trying to say.
I mean, I don't know. Is there anything you really want to say about Citizen Ruth? Because I haven't seen it, so this is really down to you. How much you want to say about this film. Because
it's a hard one to. Not really, honestly. It's a good film. If people find themselves being interested in Payne's work, I recommend they see it. It's a good film. It's funny, but it's definitely minor, and it feels like a first time director. I don't think we have to spend too much time on it. Yeah,
What would you give it out of 10, just sort of for comparison's sake, so we can...
I gave it a 7.
But we move on to Election, which is the first Alexander Payne film I've seen, and it's very easily my favorite one of what I have seen. I think I think it's genuinely quite funny. I think what I've found with his films so far is that they're all sort of mildly amusing, and there's a handful of moments where I'm sort of like, oh, that's a decent joke. But Election, is I think it's a legitimately great film. And I think it also helps, like it came out in 1999, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the best year of cinema just in general, because it's like you look at 1999 and you're like, how did just every great film come out in this year? And I think, it's not like Election is like one of the best films per se, so like top of the top best films, but it's still very good, and I do really like it a lot. And yeah, my favorite Alexander Payne film of what I have seen.
yeah, that's a surprisingly common. I mean, I guess I shouldn't say surprising, but it's a decently common opinion actually. I see a lot of people say Election is their favorite. It's my second favorite. I love it. It's I think this film is a complete riot. It's a blast. It's like you said. It's truly very funny.
Mm.
It is maybe my favorite Reese Witherspoon performance that I've seen. I think the character of Tracy Flick is an iconic one that is helped by her performance and partially Payne's writing. I really also like Matthew Broderick in this a lot. The way he
Mm.
plays, he's almost like a typical Payne protagonist that you would see in his later films, where he's like kind of like this sad sack guy who's kind of a loser, honestly. So that is sort of a tie-in between Citizen Ruth. It's a satire like Citizen Ruth, and also has that sort of sad sack middle-aged male at its center, like most of his future films would.
Yeah, I think this film, sort of in the hands of like a different filmmaker, it could be like this is the kind of film I feel like where if I sort of you could sort of read the plot synopsis and it could go sort of either way. Like I feel like in terms of how well it would work at what it's doing, like I think it could sort of it feels like it's on that border of being this great sort of hilarious comedy and sort of falling over into just sort of something a bit crap. I think it toes a nice line of like does work well for what it is. Like it knows what it's doing, and it's pitching itself at the right level. And I think that's really important, because I think a lot of films, like there are like not to name films per se, but like I've definitely seen films where it feels like they are not pitching themselves at the level that they should be. Like they're trying to pitch themselves as something either more or less than what they are, and they sort of don't work. But I think this film is pitched at a level where it knows what it's doing, and it largely succeeds in what it is doing.
Yeah, and I think everyone knows what they're doing too. Every member of the cast is really on the same level. No one's overplaying it too hard. No one's underplaying it, which is really important for a satire, because sometimes in satire you can get in bad satires you can get some people who are think it's like sort of like this really deadpan satire, and they're playing it pretty serious. And then you get someone who's
Mm.
trying to be larger than life, and I think everyone knows the wavelength this film is on, and they do a really good job of it. I want to shout out Chris Klein as Paul in this.
Mm.
I think he's really funny, and
Mm.
when they're doing the little sequence right before the third act where they're all praying the night before the election, he makes me laugh a
Mm.
lot. Where he's talking about, he's like, God, I just want to thank you for giving me a penis that I've been told is slightly above average, or whatever he says. That makes me laugh every time. His delivery on that is really good.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I'd have to agree with you that this is the best Reese Witherspoon performance I've seen. I think Reese Witherspoon's very great. I do think Matthew Broderick I also think he does a really good job in this film, and I do like this sort of I like the idea of it's just sort of this teacher who just wants to fuck over this high school student. It's an incredibly narcissist selfish thing to do, and I think that creates a great setup. It's this guy who is just being a dick for no reason. There's no justifiable way in which there's no reason he should be doing what he is doing.
Yeah, it's completely petty. There's no justification given at all.
But I think that works in this context for a comedy. I think it's okay if the plot stems from something that's inherently quite petty. I think that's fine. I think with a comedy you can sort of be a bit more it doesn't have to be that deep. It can just be he just he's being incredibly petty and doesn't want her to do well. And I think that's great. I think that really adds something, and it in the sense of it doesn't because comedy a lot of comedy, a lot of great comedy, I think is it doesn't you don't need to have not all the sometimes but not always, you can just have sort of simple setup that you don't need everything to be the most well-rounded thing.
It's oftentimes I find it's even funnier when you can just be, if handled well in the hands of someone who's talented. If when a comedy just goes full unserious with its plot, a lot of times it's even fun. And I do want to. I know you're not American, but I do just want to shout out how the foresight of this film for the American election cycles that came after, particularly 2016, where you have a woman who is clearly more qualified and the most qualified candidate running for office, and then you have just a guy who's a complete doofus who just last minute gets put up against her, and everyone just wants to vote for him because they hate her, and people just hate her for no reason. They just think she's annoying and they want to take her down. It's very very predictive of how American elections would go in the 21st century for a film that came out in 1999. Definitely.
I think, to be honest, I think if this is how every Alexander Payne film was sort of made, if it was more just of an overt comedy, I think I would like them more. But I think that the thing with this is it doesn't really feel like it's trying to be as emotionally resonant as I feel like his other films are, and I don't think that works for me in the same way. I'm fully I don't have a problem with a filmmaker or a writer wanting to make a film that is trying to be emotionally resonant and have this emotional side to it, but I think it needs to be done well, and I don't think I mean it doesn't work in the same way I think his comedy works. I think it's because this film is a very good film, and it's my favorite. And I think because it's not really trying to be this big emotional thing, whereas about Schmidt and Sideways and the other one, and I've seen the holdovers, but about Schmidt and Sideways, which we'll get onto later on, are films that are trying to be more emotionally. They're meant to get you in the they're meant to hit you to get you in the feels, and I don't think it works in that same way.
Yeah, and that's understandable. I mean, I think for that reason is why a lot of people would agree with you and call this their favorite of his films. We'll get to it later when we get with it to those films, but I do find emotional resonance in his other stuff, so that's why I still like the direction he goes in his other films. But I mean, not to put down Election at all for not having emotional resonance. I love it.
And this was Alexander Payne's first Oscar nomination.
Correct. Yes, it was a best or adapted or original screenplay. I don't remember.
It says it's adapted screenplay here. His first Oscar nomination of 7 that he's received. Yeah, it's just interesting because I feel like Election's that kind of film that depending on the year, in a modern year, it could squeeze into screenplay, but I don't know if it necessarily would in I think the Oscars sort of the very hit or miss. I feel like sometimes the Oscars sort of feel like they go for sort of an outsider, sort of like a film that like deserves it, or sometimes they just sort of go for like what's getting into Best Picture this year. We'll just nominate 5 of those for this category.
And a lot of times a film like this, they almost deem as like too unserious, and they won't touch it at all, just because they think it's below them.
Yeah,
But the film
like
was pretty critically acclaimed, so that helped
yeah,
it.
but yeah, I do like Election a lot. I mean, I've got it on DVD. That's how I first watched it because I was like, I've heard this is a good film, and I do really enjoy it, and I think it. I don't. The ending is a bit like I sort of I like that this film it plays with this. It sort of has the structure of Matthew Broderick. The entire film he's trying to fuck over Reese Witherspoon and her goals, and by the end he's the one who's in. He comes out worse from doing this.
Yeah.
It's this sort of
Mhm.
obsessive quality, this whole obsession about this person, and in the end he ends up like alone, and everything's just ends terribly for him, and which I
Yeah, it
think
kind of ruins his life.
and I think that's a and like I think that's an interesting idea of looking at obsession and how it can overtake you and ruin your life. Like a couple months ago now, I looked at Promising Young Woman on the podcast, and that's also a film about obsession and how it can, and look like the way I think obsession is a really interesting idea and a really interesting theme to cover in a film, and sort of like is this because like films about obsession generally it doesn't work at like Whiplash, for example, again also covered on the podcast. That's a film about obsession, and I think it adds a whole new level. Films about obsession I find very interesting because so often it's like it's interesting to see how far a character will go to achieve a goal and what they're willing to lose to achieve that goal. And I mean, that's the whole point of Whiplash. Promising Young Woman deals with that, and Election as well deals with that. And I think it is interesting to look at that idea and see how it affects. I mean, I also find it interesting to see how it affects not just the character who is obsessed, but how it affects the people around them and how they react to it as well. I think it's a really great theme and concept to deal with in a film, in just stories in general.
Yeah, it's really interesting. All those films you mentioned, I'm a big fan of. So I think, and I had never even really thought of obsession as a theme the same way you were bringing it up. Being me personally being such a big fan of it, but as you're bringing up these films and I'm realizing I like all of them, yeah, it's definitely a really interesting topic to cover.
All the time to read. I do like it, and I do think there's a lot to enjoy in it. But I think, and the ending sort of with Tracy Reese Witherspoon's character, being like with congressman, I think it's interesting that like he tried all of this and it still didn't work, and it just points out the fruitlessness of this endeavor of like he tried all of this and it just did not work, and I think I really like that. I think that's a really interesting way of like, to element and topic to deal with. But yeah, I really like Collection. I give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, it's one of my all time favorite satires. I have it at a 10. It's one of the few Payne films that I have a 10. I've rewatched it several times. I can throw it on whenever. I can watch it from whenever, and I have a blast every single time.
Mm.
I think it's amazing.
So then we continue on with About Schmidt, which I watched yesterday. I I don't. Yeah, I wasn't. I think this is probably my least favorite Alexander Payne film I've seen so far. I wasn't really taken by it.
The first time I watched it, I had a similar experience. I was not a big fan of it at all. On rewatch, I definitely liked it more. It grew on me a
Hmm.
bit, particularly I think the Nicholson performance is strong.
Yeah.
Um, and which it would have to be because the film is so reliant on that. You're following him for quite literally the entire runtime, basically. For some reason, something just didn't click it with it for me on the first watch, and I didn't really like it. I liked it a bit more on the rewatch a couple months ago that I did when we had first talked about doing this podcast, and
Hmm.
he it just clicked a bit more. I was a bit more charmed by it. I want to say it's still nowhere near a favorite of mine of his works. I'm interested.
I think it really felt like it. I liked the ideas it was like. This is the thing. I think here's the thing I found with Alexander Payne is I really like the ideas that his films are dealing with. It's just the execution that doesn't quite land, and I think this film, for me, it really feels like it, especially towards the end, like that final scene where he reads the letter. It feels like it's trying to make you, yeah, it's trying to get you emotionally invested in it and make you like cry, and I find that generally annoying. I think I find it like I'm not again. I'm fine. If a film is, it's not that I don't mind. I have a problem with crying at a film. I just think some films, that's what they're so blatantly trying to do, and that annoys me more than I feel like, because it just sort of feels like that's and I don't think it really works, and I found it incredibly meandering, which is arguably the point of it, but I don't really enjoy that too much, like, unless there's a character that I really enjoy following. I don't really. This film just feels, yeah, a lot of it is just sort of meandering about, and I think it sort of could have been trimmed down by a little bit, and it would have been infinitely more engaging, I think, and I would have enjoyed it a lot more if it sort of trimmed the fat a bit. But I know that, and I know a lot of people do like this film, and I understand that, but it just is not. This is not the kind of film that I really get a lot out of.
It's interesting for me. One of the things you specifically singled out as your least favorite thing about it, the ending with the letter. That
Hmm.
actually is, I think, my favorite part. Because weirdly enough, even though for 95% of the runtime or whatever, even on my rewatch, I was thinking the same thing you were talking about, how I found it was kind of meandering. It was a bit, and his other films can be a bit meandering too, but with this one, I just wasn't as taken with Nicholson's character as I am with his characters in Payne's characters in some of his other films. And so, like, there's a couple times where it's kind of like, all right, like we can get moving here. Like the RV scene with the other couple. Like there's a couple times
Oh
where
God,
it
yeah.
was just I was just a bit like, all right, like let's speed this up a bit. But for some reason, for whatever reason, even though I never particularly felt too attached to the main character, the ending got me. Even though I could tell it was manipulative, I knew what you were exactly like you were saying. I know exactly what it's going for. Uh, it's not subtle at all. It's clearly trying to be
No,
this big emotional climactic
yeah.
moment. But for some reason, I was just like, oh man, like I don't know when and maybe just is that Nicholson's such a good actor that when he starts crying, I'm automatically like, oh man, like that's sad. And so it's probably largely because of him. But for whatever reason, yeah, that ending scene, it did hit me in the feels a little bit. I have to say, despite not
Mhm.
loving the film up to that point.
Yeah, I want to make it clear. I think Jack Nicholson is far and away the best part of this film. Like, it's hard to.
Yes.
I mean, he's one of the best to ever do it. Like, he's one of the greatest actors of all time. It's hard to not like think he's great in it, and I think, yeah, again, it's hard to, because it's Jack Nicholson. It's like, I don't think I've ever seen him give a bad performance. He's like
Yeah, can't think of one off
consistently
the top of
always
my head.
a great, and I've seen him in a few things, and he's not always like his Nicholson best. Like, there are definitely levels to that, and this isn't like top tier Jack Nicholson, but like this is, it's solid Jack Nicholson. This was sort of towards the end of his career. Like, he was, this was like sort of one of his last performances. This was his last Oscar nomination, if I recall correctly, I believe. And I think he does carry some. I think if it wasn't Nicholson in this part, I probably wouldn't. I probably like this film even less than I already do. And I don't hate this film. Don't get me wrong. I think this is a perfectly fine movie that I just don't have anything to yeah, I just don't have anything really major about it that I connected with. And I think, yeah, again, it feels like I do like the idea of like his wife dies and he sort of has to sort of deal with that. I do like that's what that that sort of the film is. And I kind of wish it was more, because the sort of wedding aspect, I kind of am like, I'm less interested in that. I honestly would prefer if the film was just about this guy having to deal with the fact that his wife died and how he sort of moves on from that, because I think that's a really interesting story. The whole wedding element, I think, is just sort of like, oh, and him having to deal with the death of his wife again. It would sort of be a very plotless film. Like it would also I feel like be rather meandering, but I feel like I would enjoy it more because the concept, the idea of dealing with grief and loss is a concept, ideas that I really strongly connect with. I've dealt with that kind of thing, and I think it really. I think that would have made, if that's what this film was, I probably would have liked it a lot more. I Again, I like the sort of that sort of bit towards the beginning where like just after his wife has died and he's just sort of bit going through the motions. He opens like the cabinet, those cabinet doors, and there's just like barely anything in the in the cabinet or whatever. Like that, I really liked that. I like that as an idea. And then it just sort of loses that, and thus the film sort of becomes less interesting for me.
Yeah,
And I just
I
sort of
do.
like,
I do really like those first 20 minutes of the film where he's writing the first letter to the kid, and he's
mhm,
talking about all the things he doesn't like about his wife, and then she dies immediately after, and it's him reckoning with his feelings about her, and then him also dealing with the grief and the loss, like you mentioned. And I do really like that stretch of the film, and him when he's retiring, and then he goes back in, and they're kind of like trying to get rid of him when he goes back in. All that
mm,
midlife crisis stuff, I find quite compelling. It is. I agree with you. It loses a bit of steam as we get deeper into the weddings plot.
yeah. And I mean, also in this one we've got Kathy Bates. Yeah, I kind of it. Point of it is is like that her character is to make me feel uncomfortable, but it really felt a bit like, okay, we get the point. It sort of felt like the film sort of at a certain point, it was just like, okay, you're just doing this to see how far you can go, and there's no real reason for any of this other than you just want to do this. And I don't really like that when a filmmaker is just doing something for the sake of it,
Yeah,
because it feels like we get the point relatively early on into meeting that character. We understand that she's a bit she's a bit weird.
yeah.
This is a really fucking weird family. And I'm like, okay, cool. But it just keeps going on. And then, like, when she gets into the hot tub, I was like, I
I
didn't
was going
need
to say,
this.
you're telling me you didn't see her jump naked. You didn't need to see her jump naked into the hot tub.
No, no, please. I don't. No, I didn't need to. I didn't need to see that at all. And I think I don't really know. And no, I do kind of get what it's saying. Like, it sort of sparks a realization in Nicholson's character that, like, oh, is this the right family for my daughter? But it doesn't really feel like it's kind of developed enough. I don't know. It feels like it's trying to say something, and the development of what it's trying to make a point, but it feels kind of half baked. And I don't like. I think I understand what it's saying, but I also am just sort of like, I don't make that the film. Like, I feel like it's a film of two halves, and it's trying to do two separate things at once, and it just does not work. It feels like half of the film is trying to be this sort of emotional film about this guy dealing with grief, and the other half is him realizing that his daughter is going to marry into this weird ass family. Like, I feel like that's two different stories, and they don't come together in a way that feels that it feels sort of, they feel sort of disconnected plots. Like I feel like and you know, the film, I read the plot synopsis before I watched it, and I heard like, oh, it's a film about a guy sort of trying to reconnect with his daughter something after the death of his wife or whatever, and I was like, okay, I like that, but it never yeah, it just doesn't feel developed. It feels like that was an idea, and it's still kind of there, but it's not really explored in a way that I kind of wish it was.
Yeah, I see. I can't disagree with anything you're saying. I think the only reason that it comes out positive, that it came out as a positive, like a good positive film for me, is just for whatever reason. I think it's just the Nicholson performance, and I was just charmed by it. But like, I completely agree with everything you're saying about how the two parts feel disconnected, and I think you could definitely make a film where you can connect him losing his wife and him wanting to reconnect with his daughter who's getting married to a guy that he does
Mm,
not necessarily approve of. I think you could connect to those two parts. I think it just
mhm.
didn't fully gel here into
Yeah,
something as great as I wanted it to be, or I think it had the potential to be.
yeah. I think as well. I feel like the film is kind of trying to do that, and I think those two, yeah, like you just mentioned, yeah, those two sort of elements, you can connect those. Like there's a very easy way to connect those two elements, but it just doesn't. It does feel very disconnected, and I don't. And I like a lot of the ideas that the film's tackling clearly trying to portray. And I don't dislike the film. Don't get me wrong. I know I'm complaining a lot about it, but I think it's I was happy to watch it, and I think it's a very sort of easy to watch film. It's just not a film that I see myself revisiting a whole lot, because I just don't think there's as much to it in sort of the way that I wish there was. And I find this with films a lot, is I love what a film is like this films I watch where I'm like, I love like the concepts and the ideas and what that film is trying to do, but it just never comes together in a way that works for me. And you know, again, that's completely like personal, you know, that's just how it works. And I can understand, like, you know, I just, you know, again, I'm clearly not, yeah, people, again, this is a very relatively well liked film, and I just didn't connect with it. And yeah, the final scene, again, I liked that final scene in concept. It's just, I don't think it felt just like, it didn't feel earned. Like, it could be like, okay, this scene, in like this scene, I like this scene, I like what it's doing, but I also think that this film, yeah, it doesn't earn it.
It's a solid film that never quite hits the next level. And I think that it's a similar thing. It's covering a similar thematic ground that he would do much better in his career later on. So I never see a big need to revisit it either.
No, I mean, I give it a I give it a 7, a very like low 7. Like but it's a, like, again, I was perfectly happy to watch it, you know. And again, the Nicholson performance, it's Jack Nicholson. You can't really go too wrong with him you know, as an actor. Um, but it just felt, it didn't connect in a way that it so obviously wanted to.
I gave it a 7 as well. It's my second least favorite. I have Citizen Wraith at a 7 also, but I like
Mm,
Citizen Wraith just a tad more. So
yeah.
eventually it is my second least favorite.
Mm. And we move on to the final film in this week's episode, Sideways.
There we go.
Um, Now, this is one of your, if I remember correctly, this is one of your favorite films just ever.
Yeah. Yeah, it's on the short list for one of my favorite films ever for sure. It's in my top 5.
Yeah, so I'll let you take the lead on this one, because I feel like you've got a lot more to say. So I'll
Yes,
just sit back and let you just take the lead.
I've watched this many times, and I will continue to watch it many, many times in the future. And every single time I get something else out of it, emotionally, thematically. It the I've been told in my life from friends who I've showed this film to that I think this is the number one reason I connect with it so much. That sometimes in my life I can resemble the Paul Giamatti character, and sometimes in my life I resemble Thomas Hayden Church character. And I think my favorite thing about it is not even just talking about myself. I think you can see people you know in every single one of these characters. I feel like I know a Miles. I feel like I know a Jack. I feel like I know a Maya. They're some of my favorite characters in film history. It's so well crafted. Even though you don't really know too much about them as people as the film goes on, you only learn about this weekend or week of their lives, whatever, and very little about their past. But they still feel so fully realized. They feel like real people. And my favorite kinds of films are the ones that have you feeling like you know these characters after just spending 2 hours with them or however long the film is. I'm a big wine guy. I drink a lot of wine, so I can appreciate a lot of the in jokes about wine that are in this film. I laugh every time when Paul Giamatti is like, "I'm not drinking any fucking Merlot." That's really funny. Um, when they're going on the wine tasting and he gets mad at Jack because Jack's chewing gum. It's hilarious because Paul Giamatti is just he's like this complete pretentious stickler about the finer details of wine tasting, and then you just have Jack there who just wants to have a good time and get drunk, and he's fucking chewing gum. It it's it all feels like I have been that guy. I've been drinking wine with my friends, and I'm drinking it for the taste, and my friends are just chewing gum, and I'm like, dude, come on. Like it all feels like stuff I have experienced in my life. I know none of this is like particularly interesting about the filmmaking, and I will touch on that later. The specific reason it's one of my favorites is because of the connections I can make with it, and how sometimes when I'm sad in my life or I feel like my life's not where it's at, career wise or for whatever, romantic wise, whatever, sometimes I can get down and feel like Jack Miles in the film. And I mean, I'm never going to have a temper tantrum like he does in the wine tasting where he pours the spit wine all over himself. But it's it's just I know you're not as big of a fan of it, so I am interested. And when you talk about the things you don't like, I'm sure we'll get more into the actual filmmaking and the actual performances of it. I wanted to get that in first of why it is such a personal favorite to me because the characters, how many times I've seen the film, they mean so much to me at this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't get me wrong, I do like this film, relatively speaking. I think it's probably my second favorite Payne film that I've seen. But it does not connect with me in a way. Well, first of all, it's a film about that sounds dismissive, but all the wine talk I had no king interest in at all. I was just like I had no I was like I don't know what any of this means, and I just okay. It just felt like I imagine I assume that is the point that it feels so pretentious, like, and I it feels like that's kind of the point, and like that's what it's trying to do. But I was genuinely like, okay, drinking wine. I was just like, I don't. I've never. Well, I don't drink, so I want to make that clear. I'm not someone who drinks. So I did think like it to me felt like I just couldn't connect, and I think this film again it's sort of going for sort of an emotional angle. And again, I just could not connect with it in a way that it clearly wanted me to. And I think it really felt like like again, I was happy to watch it, but I just did not have anything that I really like. Yeah, I just think it didn't. I didn't wasn't able to connect with it in a way that I was clearly supposed to. I thought like performance wise, it was all fairly all right. Besides Thomas Hayden Church, I actually thought Thomas Hayden Church was really great in it. But I think that it as a film, it just again it just felt like it was missing something that like it feels like there was meant to be something else that I was meant to take from it, and I just wasn't able to, or I just didn't think the film gave me anything really major to take, in the sense of like I knew what it was doing and I knew what like I could follow it, and like but I just didn't I could understand like some of like I understand like what it was saying and what sort of purpose was, but it just didn't land in a way that it obviously does for a lot of people. Again, this is sort of the Payne film that I feel like gets sort of the most recognition generally. Like I think this is probably up there. Certainly one of his most well regarded films. I mean, this was Best Picture nominated. It won screenplay. You know, like it did very well at the Oscars.
Very critically acclaimed too. I think it has like a 94 on Metacritic, something like that. Like it's critics really loved this thing. Yeah.
Yeah, like if I was to look at it, I think it's his second highest rated on IMDb. Yeah, as a film though, it sideways. It really didn't. Yeah, because you were touching on sort of the sort of emotional aspect and how it sort of you connected with it and got a lot out of it, and I just couldn't, and I just didn't. Is there sort of any specific elements in like anything particular about the
It's
that like
I think
connected
it's what
you?
yeah. I do think that connection is what takes it from merely thinking it's a good film to truly loving it like I do. I think for whatever reason, this is gonna I want to make okay, so I want to choose my words carefully here because this is gonna make me sound kind of pathetic if I'm not careful, and I don't mean it like this. But there is always something about I'm always there's something about films that have films or any sort of media that has a certain depiction of depression that like in the way Miles has it here. That I don't want to say I relate to because that's wrong. I would not consider myself to be like a depressive person, but it's just it's something I can empathize with and connect to. And even though that's not really a battle I've fought severely in my life or anything, there's just something about it that in every film that touches on it, I do get I do get something emotional out of it. Like Steve Carell's character in Little Miss Sunshine, the TV show BoJack Horseman. Like I pull a lot emotionally from this kind of media and from these kinds of stories. And there's something about the depiction of the Paul Giamatti character in this that it feels like such a realistic depiction of depression to me. Where it's not depression, like he's not like an emo guy who's constantly talking about like, oh, I'm gonna like go home and kill myself, or like it's not like that. Like he works a normal job. He's a teacher. He's clearly achieving below what he could be doing because he's a smart guy. You can tell that in the film. It's like a perpetual underachiever. A cinematic depiction of a perpetual underachiever. I can always find myself I always just take a lot out of that, and I can't quite pinpoint why because like I said, I would not describe myself like that. It's just I connect to it, and I take a lot out emotionally. And the way it's depicted in this film specifically, I do connect with it emotionally. Like it's hard for me to really like dive deep into it because I feel like it's very like you said, you understand what the film is going for. You understand everything like there was nothing that confused you about it or anything. It's just really whether you connect to it or you don't. And I just found myself really connecting to it and the characters.
Yeah. To touch on like because I've talked to people about depression in media, and I was talking to someone, and that they feel that In Bruges is the sort of best portrayal of depression in
That's
a film,
another one of my
and
favorite films.
to be fair, I think I would agree with that. Yeah, I think it. Yeah, this film really. Yeah, it very much depends of like. Yeah, can you connect? Because you sort of got the two. You've got Paul Giamatti's character who just sort of like he just wants to be tasting wine. He wants to be and really sort of take this all in. And then Thomas Hayden Church is much more free, just drinking wine and cheating on his fiance. Like it's a very different but yeah, to sort of touch on the performances, I think it's a solid Paul Giamatti performance. Probably my favorite of his. I think it's a really solid. I think he gives a good performance. I don't think it's quite my favorite, but it is a solid turn from him. Thomas Hayden Church. I really like Thomas Hayden Church, and I don't know what he's ever done to earn that. Oh, that's right. He's the Verminator in Over the Hedge. That's where it comes from, and like I think he's legitimately great in that film, to be honest. And I think he's because he is a very much sort of the light-hearted sort of comedy of the film. I think I think he brings a real comedic edge to it. And again, I think Alexander Payne, when he goes for comedy, like I do think he's very good at going for more comedic moments as opposed to sort of the more emotional ones. So I think that's why I like Thomas Hayden Church so much, because his character is quite comedic and quite funny.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Thomas Hayden Church, though, because that actually brings me to another point I did want to make. When I really like how the film it shows like two completely different sides of like fractured masculinity, because Paul Giamatti is a far more typical like depressed character in that like he feels stuck in his job, he can't get his book he wants to write off the ground, he's divorced, like blah blah, all that. But Thomas Hayden Church, he plays like almost like an equally broken guy, but not in a traditional sense at all. Like he's broken in the sense of he can't commit to this clearly lovely woman that he is engaged to. His entire goal of going into this bachelor party is he wants to get laid. He wants to have his last hurrah to cheat on her. And then there's the scene that I love that on rewatch, it always sticks out to me, is when they're at the hotel bar and he's telling Paul Giamatti, he's like, I'm having second thoughts. Like, let's bail on this. Let's you open up a wine store, we'll move out here. I will leave my fiance at the altar, basically. And you can tell, because it says in the film that they were college roommates, and you can tell, despite how Paul Giamatti is the much more classically broken guy, so much of his life probably was spent having to talk Thomas Hayden Church's character down from these ledges because he's so impulsive, and he's as equally fucked up as Paul Giamatti's character, just in a different way and in a less obvious way.
Yeah, I think his stuff is sort of the more interest. I don't know if it's more like theoretically the Paul Giamatti stuff is more. Well, I guess it depends really. I think it would come down to writing as to which sort of like, because I think because Thomas Hayden Church sort of on the surface his character is far more comedic, but sort of as the film progresses and sort of as it goes on, you can see there's a lot more to him than is initially a shot. Like he could have just been this one note character who's just sort of the comic relief, but as we see as we follow through the story, he's like makes it clear like he's not entirely sure if like this is what he wants to be doing, and I think it
and he's clinging to an acting career that has clearly passed him by. He was like a TV star is like a much younger guy, obviously, and he's still trying to cling to want to be an actor. Like there's a lot more to that character than just like goofy friend who wants to get laid. Like you see that in a lot of road trip movies, and there's clearly a lot more to this character.
But sort of Paul Giamatti and Thomas Hayden Church, they're the main two that we follow. But we sort of meet sort of a few other people. There's Sandra Oh and Stephanie, who Thomas Hayden Church is cheating with. Of course, she doesn't know, and then she beats the shit out of him when she finds out. And then there's Virginia Madsen as Maya, who, and I think, it's sort of, as an overall feeling, I do think like it's a solid cast. Like they all do a decent job, but the beyond like Giamatti and Church, I don't really love any of the other I wouldn't even say I love Paul Giamatti, but I do think he's fairly solid. But like it's Thomas Hayden Church is the performance that I really like in this, but I think sort of, the film sort of as a general, sort of in a general sense, it's solid, and it this is very much that kind of film that I can appreciate. Like I get this with films, relative, not all the time, but I do get it where I can appreciate when a film is like doing something, and like I don't like connect with it, but I understand why it is a film that it's just not a film that I connect with in a way that it does for, and that's not a problem. I connect emotionally with films that other people don't, and this just is not that kind of film that I can connect with, in the sense of it is trying to, and I don't mind, and I do like what it's trying to say, but it's the way in which it's portrayed that doesn't land for me. Like I find this a lot. I appreciate what a film's trying to do, but it's just the way that it's done that matters, and I don't think this film necessarily does it in a way that I'm particularly. Again, it's also a very meandering film. Like I think Alexander Payne's films, besides Election, really feel very meandering, and there's not really that much plot to them. They're just sort of things happening, which I don't necessarily mind per se, but they do feel very meandering and just sort of like, and I think the reason why Election works so well is like there's a very definitive plot in that. Like you can see like there's an A to B sort of these things happen, whereas I feel like About Schmidt and Sideways and all that, they feel sort of like, they're just sort of things happening, and there's no, I don't want to say there's no plot, but they are kind of just things happening. They're sort of more, the plot is not really as much of a focus. It's sort of just, things
They're character
happening
driven.
for a
They're
couple
character
hours.
driven more than plot driven. It's and one scene that I do want to shout out that I think is just really well written by Payne and Jim Taylor, who's his longtime writing partner. He writes most of his scripts with him, I believe. Is the scene where Giamatti and Madsen are talking to each other outside outside of Sandra Oh's house, and they're talking about their favorite wines and what they like about their favorite wines, and they're clearly like they're describing themselves through the wine. Like Paul Giamatti is talking about how like a Pinot Noir is a grape that needs to be nurtured, and only the right kind of person can really help it fulfill its potential. And Virginia Madsen, when she's talking about her favorite wine, she's like clearly talking about her and her recent divorce. Um, I just think that's really good writing, and I don't even know if I necessarily caught that on first watch, because the first time I watched this film, I was like 16, so I may not have even picked up on that. But on future watches, I definitely picked it up that they're clearly describing themselves, and I thought that was an interesting way to do that, rather than you would see in a worse film. You'd see like two people who are kind of like each other. The dialogue would be a lot more obvious.
Yeah. I think this is a film that potentially I could, like, this does scream to me like a film that sort of you might appreciate more the older you, like, again, it sort of depends. Yeah, it feels like this could be something that you connect with more the older you get, and I'm not saying that will happen, of course, but I'm saying I think this film, because it's sort of dealing with like a midlife crisis. I say like that's sort of the impression that it gives. He's sort of um
Yeah,
doing all
and Thomas
these,
Hayden Church too, in a
yeah,
different way. But yeah,
and the way in which I do like how they have sort of, they're both sort of going through sort of similar things, but the way they deal with them are very, very different. Like Paul Giamatti is just like, I'll just drink and I'll get drunk, and Thomas Hayden Church is like, I'm just gonna have sex. That's the way that he's planning to deal with it. And I think that's interesting. And again, it's sort of interesting in the way in which a film can portray sort of the same thing, like that, like having characters dealing with the same thing, but the way in which it portrays that thing, I think, is really great, and I really appreciate
Yeah.
that.
It'd be a lot more boring if they were both just like alcoholics who were depressed in that way. I think it's a lot more interesting, and I buy their friendship a lot more because they're kind of going through the same thing, but in such a different way. Like it makes their friendship far more interesting to me.
Because sort of beforehand, I kind of, this film, I'd read the plot synopsis and I was just like, oh, it's just about two friends going on a bachelor. Like it theoretically shouldn't be that. It's people going on a bachelor trip. But like obviously, like something's always going to happen. Just a lot, like because of how filmmaking works. But the idea of of dealing with sort of depression and sort of that kind of thing, and the ways in which they portray, because I think depression and the way it's portrayed in media sometimes can be really well done, and sometimes it can be offensively bad. And I think this is
Yeah, sometimes like The Sun. Did you see The Sun last year?
I have not seen The Sun.
Oh my god, talk about offensively bad depictions of depression. Jesus.
Yeah, and yeah, I think depression is an idea, as like as a theme in a film. It needs to be done well, because it can feel very it can feel exploitative is the real thing. Is It's like it does it and it feels, and I don't think Sideways does. I feel like it not like it doesn't like connect with me, but I doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel offensive. It feels like I know what it's doing and I don't connect with it, but I can see how one could. Like it doesn't feel like a caricature of depression.
Yeah, it's not. It's very. I don't think anybody could reasonably accuse it of that for sure.
Yeah,
It's
like
done in
I
good.
think you could. mm, Yeah, like you could say that you don't connect with. Like I think it's fair if you don't connect with it, but I don't think you can fault it on the basis of how it portrays depression. I don't think you could fault it in that aspect.
Yeah, definitely not. It's not a. It's not a manipulative or exploitative film at all.
Yeah, no, it does. It's not trying to, like, it's being emotional, but it doesn't feel like it's trying to get you, like as we mentioned with About Schmidt. Like About Schmidt, that final scene is so obviously trying to make you cry, and I
Exactly.
don't
There's
think
nothing in Sideways that makes.
Sideways. Yeah, Sideways isn't really trying to do that. I feel like it's and that's probably why I like it, because it doesn't feel like it's trying to make you get emotional. It's just sort of showing these things. Yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, and I think that's sort of always a tough sort of level, because some films are very much like, okay, I obviously see that you're trying to get me emotional, and yeah, it just doesn't connect. And I not to say that this film got me emotional, but it never felt. It felt like sincere in the sense of like some films like go for emotional moments, they feel incredibly insincere, and like they're just trying to get you to feel this certain way without actually earning that.
I mean, I think it's. I think it's the crown jewel of his career. It's his. I know you prefer Election. There's a lot of people who do prefer Election, and I think that's fair. But for my money, this is his magnum
Mm.
opus.
um
I just
yeah
think
I
everything came together so perfectly here.
mhm. And I can understand why. Like it doesn't, I don't connect with it, and I see how it could, like, it is able to connect with people, but I'm not one of those people, so I just
Mm.
can't fully love this film. Like
Yeah.
it as a film, I understand what it's doing and I like what it's doing. And there's some scene, I do like there are some scenes, there are some moments and stuff that I do really enjoy about it, but it just doesn't fully come together for me as a whole. It feels sort of more, yeah, it just doesn't completely land in a way that I wish it did. Like I wish I loved this film more because there's so much about it that I do love. It's just, yeah, the portrayal of what it's doing is not, doesn't connect to me.
You just didn't get the emotional connection from it. And that's fine. I mean, like you said, different films connect with different people in different ways.
Yeah, so I give it a 7. A fairly sturdy 7 out of 10.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's a 10 for me, since I said it's one of my favorite films of all time.
Yeah,
I am really interested when we do part 2. I'm the one I'm really, because I know you've seen the Holdovers, so I do kind of know your thoughts on that. But the one I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on when we do part 2 is The Descendants.
I think I found sort of so far in the films that I've seen of Alexander Payne, I get more out of the comedy elements. As I mentioned, I thought Election is my favorite film of his. So but the emotional side doesn't work as well. But I don't know. Maybe that's because because we've only really touched on the sort of early part, the sort of the first half of his career, and maybe he'll sort of mature more as a filmmaker, and he'll be able to get more, like, be able to hone it a bit more potentially. I don't know. I haven't seen Descendants or anything. I've seen Holdovers, but I haven't seen Descendants or Nebraska or Downsizing yet. Although I haven't heard a good word about Downsizing. So yeah. But I think that's pretty much it for part 1. Unless there's anything else that you wanted to say.
No, I think I got everything I needed to say.
Is there anything you would like to plug?
Yeah. Well, if anyone wants to follow me on Letterboxd, it's my username is just my name, Zach Ruggiero. Same thing on Twitter. You can follow me there. See me tweet about sports or about films. I do plenty of both. Or also check out the Midnight Critics Circle, which we're both a part of, and we both have reviews published on there. If you want to see what I've written about certain films or see our awards, because those are coming up real soon.
Yeah, so thank you all for listening to this week's episode. This is episode 141. I think I lose track of episodes. There's a lot of episodes, so there's a massive back catalogue of episodes you can go back and listen to. So literally, this is the 4th year. This is the beginning of the 4th year I'm doing this. You've got 3 years worth of episodes to go back and listen to. And next week's episode is going to be good because it'll be the anniversary of when I started this show. I started the show January 24th, and that's next Wednesday. So that's when part 2 of this will be out. So that's going to be, it's the anniversary episode of this show. So yeah, listen to all the previous episodes. Follow social medias, Instagram, Facebook, if you so choose to. Yeah, I'm on Letterboxd. William F. It should be easy to find. Yeah, Midnight Critics Circle. I'm also a member of that. I do some writing occasionally for that, and yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.